Before we start, let's take a look and have a look where Crete's located. Crete is the largest island in the Aegean, and it's the 5th largest island in the Mediterranean. It lies to the south of the Aegean Sea and forms a link between Europe, Asia, and Africa. And this geographical position at the junction of major civilizations and cultural currents has greatly influenced Crete's history. I'm going to be talking about 3 major transition points in Cretan prehistory today. Firstly, the initial Neolithic at around 7000 BC. Secondly, the final Neolithic transition with the early Bronze Age between 3500 and 3000 BC. And thirdly, the pre-palatial transition to the first palace period at 2200 to 1950 BC. I plan to show that the emergence of the so-called Minoan civilization or palace culture is the result of both internal and external knowledge. That is, the coming together of socially more complex peoples from Anatolia and the Near East, the skills and resources from the Cycladic Islands, and the internal infrastructure created by the indigenous Cretan people. Although I won't be focusing upon the individual components of eternal knowledge, I will be trying to identify the likely regions of origin for ancient knowledge coming to Crete at these important points in time. I've included a range of evidence from a number of different experts in order to give as clear a picture as possible of what appears to be happening. When most people think of Crete, they think of King Minos, the Minotaur, Theseus, and that Crete, like Sparta or Athens, is just another Greek kingdom. But who were the Cretans? And where did they come from? And where did the ancient knowledge that led to the flourishing culture of the Minoan palaces come from or originate? Up until recently, it was believed that the first visitors to Crete were Neolithic farmers arriving at about 7000 BC. That is until Thomas Strasser's team from Providence College on Rhode Island discovered some very exciting evidence during a survey in 2008-2009. Excavations in the Plakius region of Crete revealed stone tools made of quartz at least 130,000 years old. Even more intriguing, the style of the hand axes suggests that they could be anything up to 700,000 years old, as they resemble artifacts from the Aegean period, which originated with pre-human populations in Africa during the Lower Paleolithic. Aegean is the name given to an archaeological industry of stone tool manufacture that's associated with early humans during the Lower Paleolithic period, about 1.7 million years ago. And this is sensational news because Crete has been an island for over 5 million years. So these early visitors reached the island using seacraft capable of open sea navigation and multiple journeys. This is really exciting because it pushes back previous evidence of seafaring in the Mediterranean by more than 100,000 years. Previous evidence was from the Frankfurt cave region where obsidian from the island of Milos was found at about 10,000 BC. So what does this show? Firstly, it creates the probability that, although not yet fully recognised in the archaeological record, there is likely to have been indigenous pre-Neolithic population on Crete. Secondly, it shows that from very early on, Crete is likely to have been accessible from both the eastern Mediterranean and also from North Africa. And this demonstrates that ancient knowledge on Crete goes back much further than the Neolithic. Returning to the Neolithic, Crete is significant because it's one of the earliest areas outside of the Near East to have had village farming. And it's also one of the earliest successful maritime transfers of a full farming economy. But what is the actual evidence on Crete for new migrants arriving and bringing their knowledge with them? What changes are showing up in the archaeological record? I've divided the evidence up into two groups. Evidence relating to people, that's DNA, relationship of DNA with linguistic evidence, and burial. And on the other side, I've got evidence related to production. That's domesticated animals, wheat, and stone tools. So let's have a look at the DNA first. The results of a Y chromosome survey in a 2007 paper by Carter, King, and others provide us with a means of tracking migration during the establishment of the first Neolithic farming communities on Crete. The survey sampled 171 males from 3 areas in Greece, in villages near known initial and early Neolithic sites. So central Macedonia, Thessaly, and the Peloponnese. And it also sampled 193 adult males from 4 areas on Crete. An analysis of the Y chromosome groups determined that samples taken from the males in the 3 areas on Greece showed a strong affinity to data from the Balkans, while the samples from those 4 areas on Crete showed an affinity with Central and Mediterranean Anatolia. So the Y chromosome group showing up in Thessaly and Macedonia is scarce on Crete, and the group showing up on Crete is scarce on the Greek mainland. And this evidence is important as it clearly separates migrants on Crete at this time, at this moment in time, from those on mainland Greece. The genetic data from this survey, it clearly supports Arthur Evans and others' long-held theory that Crete's colonists came from Anatolia, specifically from those sites where those areas where the well-known Neolithic sites of Azekli-Hewick, Chattel-Hewick, Hasilar on region T7, shown on this map here, and Yumuk Tepe near Mersin and Tarsus, that's region T6 on the slide. And what's very interesting for us here today is that this also supports David Roll's belief that the Cretans, or Cretim, may have come from a region known as the Kabul Triangle in northwest Syria. Although the DNA evidence relates to a much earlier time than when the first representations of ball leaping from Crete or Syria appear, region T6 places us firmly in the area that David Roll suggests that ball leaping originated. The different patterns of dispersal of groups J2A M410 and J2B M12 to Crete and southern Europe respectively broadly supports Colin Renfrew's model that claims an early split of Anatolian languages from the rest of Indo-European languages at around 7000 BC. So put simply, the group arriving in Crete would have spoken a different language from the group arriving on the Greek mainland. Those arriving in Crete may have spoken an Anatolian-related language, which may be reflected in the undeciphered Cretan hieroglyphic on Linear A. Or alternatively, Nichols suggests that they may have been speaking a language related to Hattic, a non-Indo-European language related to Hattic of central Anatolia. So let's move on to the last piece of evidence for this section of the table, Cretan burial evidence. This also seems to provide further evidence of people bringing ancient knowledge to Crete from Anatolia, and thus supporting Arthur Evans' theory. Archaeologist John Evans, in the mid-1960s, reported 7 burials from Knossos. And none of these burials were of adults, they were all of children or of newborn babies. Interestingly, current evidence suggests that intramural burial started at Çatalhöyük, one of the regions specifically identified by the DNA data as having genetic links with Crete and ancient Cretan populations. One example from Çatalhöyük indicates that neonates were buried high in the walls. Moving on to the second side of the table, currently, the consensus is that the first occupation at Knossos consisted of a small group of farmers arriving in seacraft from a coastal region of southwestern Anatolia, bringing with them what archaeologists call the typical Neolithic package. And that's usually defined as a key set of domesticated animals and plants. Moving on to plants, remains of wheat and domesticated animals provide decisive evidence of the earliest agriculture on Crete. The earliest Nevel at Knossos, that's stratum 10, contained remains of domestic wheat and bread, and the predominant cereal is Triticum aestivum. Mouthful. It's clearly evident in Anatolia, but interestingly, it's rare, if not absent, from most Balkan and Greek initial Neolithic sites. The suite of plants brought to Crete during this period recovered from the very earliest levels of Knossos, including weeds, are known only from earlier sites in central and Mediterranean Anatolia. They are also known as well from Cyprus and the Levant. Well, this gives us a clear signal that whoever is bringing ancient farming knowledge with them from southwest Anatolia to Crete is an entirely different social group of that travelling to mainland Greece. And so on to domesticated animals. Well, there's no pre-Neolithic evidence of sheep, cattle, pig, or goat on Crete. They're just not there in the evidence. But there are plentiful remains of these animals, this animal species, from the initial Neolithic period. So we have them. They're completely absent. Then they suddenly arrive in the initial Neolithic. Interestingly, in these domesticated animals, there is no tendency towards the dwarfism common amongst island populations of large mammals, and neither is there any indication of crossbreeding or hybridization. The only plausible explanation is that these early migrant farmers brought fully domestic animals with them when they crossed the sea from southwest Anatolia to Crete. Yeah. Another really interesting fact, because it pushes things back in time, is that they also brought their knowledge of ploughing with them. Recent evidence from Knossos indicates the use of cattle for ploughing or pulling loads from the late 7th millennium to the mid-6th millennium, about 3 millennia earlier than previously thought. And that was by Andrew Sherratt, I think. Okay. Yeah. It seems that the only thing these Neolithic migrants didn't bring with them is pottery. The earliest archaeological level at Knossos is aceramic or pre-pottery. But when it does appear in Crete in the Neolithic, it seems to be mature from its very first appearance in terms of shape, decoration, and technology. This probably indicates the presence of travelling potters, that is, skilled craftspeople travelling from island to island, spreading the knowledge of how to make pottery. This is also likely to be the case for stone tools. Catherine Perles has argued that in the Aegean, the skills and knowledge associated with the emergence of pressure blade technology were probably distributed by specialist seafarers or travelling craftspeople. And pressure flaking is a method of trimming the edge of a stone tool by removing small flakes by pressing the stone with a sharp implement. And that leads us nicely onto stone tools. Okay. Analysis of stone tools from the earliest Neolithic at Knossos, as well as evidence of domestic plants, plant remains, DNA and burial, support the notion that Crete was not colonised by migrants from mainland Greece during the Neolithic. Although the earliest Neolithic assemblage of stone tools from Knossos has much in common with those at the Frankfurt cave, that's just in here, suggesting a possible connection with Frankfurt at that time, James Connolly suggests that it can be safely argued that Knossos lay on the edge of the sphere of influence that saw the introduction of that particular stone technology, and does not appear to be part of the same tradition. He interprets the very marked differences between Knossos and the stone technology tool industry at Frankfurt as a clear indication that the people settling on Knossos brought with them a different technology to those settling on the mainland. So, to sum up the first section, DNA evidence that links the earliest Cretans, to sum up, we have that DNA evidence links the earliest Cretans to regions of central, south central, and southwest Anatolia. This broadly supports Renfrew's language dispersal model and suggests that Cretans spoke a different language to those migrants on the Greek mainland. We have burial evidence practice linking Crete with Çatalhöyük, and we have floral and fauna evidence linking Crete with central and Mediterranean Anatolia and the Levant, and also stone technology pointing us away from the Greek mainland. So this combination of evidence strongly indicates colonization of Crete during the Neolithic by peoples coming from and or via south central and southwestern Anatolia. They would have travelled across the sea, island hopping along the way, leaving behind areas on their journey that were unsuitable for their farming methods, in order to reach more promising habitats, and bringing with them their ancient knowledge and skills. Okay, moving on to the next part of the story. The transition occurring at the end of the Neolithic is associated with a series of major changes and mass migrations of people. And migration into Crete at this time is strongly linked to population movements that are forced by dramatically changed circumstances. So what is happening in the wider world that encourages migration to Crete at this time? German scientist Bernhard Weininger confirms that a period of rapid climate change occurred between 4000 and 3200 BC. The climate of the Mediterranean shifts to the semi-arid and highly seasonal pattern that we are familiar with today, together with the Sahara changing from a cattle-grazed expanse of lakes, savanna and steppe to arid desert, as David mentioned last night. Venegar reports that in southeastern Europe, this rapid change in climate triggered social upheaval, a drastic decline in population, and the collapse of southeastern Europe final Neolithic populations. In addition, this major shift in climate, there appears to have been a catastrophic natural event at about 3195 BC, which had a global effect, resulting in massive displacement of peoples driven to seek new security at other settlement sites. Evidence for this catastrophe ranges from a marked reduction in growth rings at about in Irish bog oaks at about 3195 BC, a lack of growth of bristle cones in western USA, and a clear decrease in the amount of pollen in the archaeological record. There does not appear to be a clear consensus upon what caused this catastrophe. Theories range from a volcanic eruption to meteors, comets striking the eastern Mediterranean. But despite not knowing exactly what this calamity was, its effects appear to have been dramatic climate change, rivers changing their courses, floods, migrating populations, and general decline. And interestingly, Crete seems to be a very popular destination at this time. It's highly likely that a combination of this disaster with the increase in aridity in the climate are implicated in the dramatic shifts in settlement patterns on the island during the 4th millennium. So let's take a look at the evidence. To demonstrate change during the final Neolithic and early Bronze Age transition, I've used the following: dramatic changes in settlement patterns, major differences in burial practice, social complexity evidenced by tholos tombs, and evidence of new DNA types. These all suggest an influx of new populations, new knowledge, and influence present on Crete during the transition from the final Neolithic to the early Bronze Age. And this influx seems to be coming from both Anatolia and the Cycladic Islands. There are a large number of new settlements on Crete at this time, and mostly are on coastal regions, and many are built on high ground with defensive walls. Recent surveys have revealed more than 100 new settlements present at this time. And one of the main areas of settlement, as you can see on the map here, is in the Cettian Bay region. Yeah. In addition to this, there is evidence to show unstable settlement and signs of conflict on the Dodecanese Islands to the east of Crete, connecting Crete to the Anatolian coast. And this occurs around 3,300 BC, and it gives us a good indication of where the problems were coming from, and that's the Anatolian coast. Surveys have shown that a short-lived population peak occurred on the Dodecanese at around 3,300, which was then followed by an abandonment of the islands and depopulation. These coexisting changes on eastern Crete and the Dodecanese in regions situated so near to each other suggest that these processes are related, with at least some of the Dodecanese island population migrating to Crete and being responsible for the foundation of the new settlements. The number and size of these settlements, however, suggests that their inhabitants did not only come from the islands themselves, but from further, from Anatolia on the mainland. Linked with these changes in settlement patterns is the arrival of a change in burial practice. New tombs appear outside of living spaces, visible in the landscape, so very different from the early Neolithic intramural burials. And these tholos tombs, or tholoi, are mostly found in the Messara plain in central Crete. They are curved, stone-built, beehive structures with internal corbelling. And they are particularly interesting because they have no predecessors on Crete and are likely to have been introduced from much further afield. Paved areas and large deposits of drinking and serving vessels have been found just outside of these tombs, likely indicating that ritual events after the burial and possible ancestor worship took place. Most of the entrances are facing towards the east, towards the rising sun. Some archaeologists suggest that the tholoi could have come from Anatolia, but they're very tentative about suggesting this because they're putting their neck on the line. But yeah, some of them do. Sinclair Hood, I think in the 1980s, did that, yeah. While others believe they may suggest immigrants from the Levant, or indeed that they are part of the native Neolithic Cretan culture. Interestingly, they are an architectural feature of the early Halath culture in the highlands of Mesopotamia during the 5th millennium. Another really interesting point about the tholoi is that they are clearly visible in the landscape of the Messara. And their construction represents a considerable investment in time and labour. This indicates that increasing social complexity is occurring on Crete at this time. The two ways that tholoi as monumental structures indicate increasing complexity are that collaboration in their construction would have been needed, and they are a demonstration to others of a common social identity. It's a sort of, here we are, and this is who we are. The surplus production that agriculture made possible in the Neolithic is a key to the social changes that make up another dimension of that period. Producing a surplus of agriculture meant that cultivators could exchange that produce in exchange for specialised services and productions of non-cultivators, that is, weavers, metal workers, tool makers. People in communities taking on different specialised roles. But the tholoi by themselves are not necessarily evidence of social hierarchy or the emergence of elites. Building them does require the cooperation of a large number of workers, but they are not single burial tombs. They are they house the bones of many generations, and they're used over a very, very long period of time. Interesting this period in time is that social complexity could indicate evidence of incoming populations interacting with the local community and creating a pool of knowledge and skills which contributes to the formation of early complex Cretan society. The Cyclades. Burial practice on Crete at this time also suggests migrants and knowledge coming from the Cycladic islands. The Cyclades is an island group in the Aegean, southeast of the Crete mainland and to the north, the Greek mainland and to the north of Crete. I believe the name actually means the encircling ones because they encircle the sacred island of Delos. The Cycladic nature of the tombs at Ayathotia in eastern Crete and Gournes on the north coast of Crete is strongly reinforced by the pottery found in them, which is largely non-Minoan. And in addition, much of the copper ore used in making the daggers found at the richest burials comes from the Cycladic islands themselves, and also from southern Attica on the Greek mainland. According to James Connolly, the technological knowledge and skill for working these metal ores also comes from the Cycladic islands. The tombs at Hagia Sophia are paralleled only at the early Cycladic cemetery at Ogrillia on the island of Epano Kufonisi, some 200 kilometres to the north, perhaps indicating to us where this influence came from. Evidence for Cycladic settlement is also suggested at the port of Poros, modern-day Heraklion, and capital of Crete. Nearly 1/3 of the pottery found here is of a Cycladic style. And yet, at nearby Knossos, only 5 kilometres to the south, all of the pottery is Minoan in character. And so is evidence of a flourishing indigenous population coexisting on Crete with the migrants from Anatolia and the Cycladic islands at the beginning of the early Bronze Age, so around 3000 BC. So back to DNA. What are the scientists telling us? What does DNA tell us about who was triggering the major settlement changes on Crete at this time? Well, the archaeological implications of the DNA data of this period are absolutely fascinating. There is evidence for the arrival of 2 DNA groups dating to circa 3100 BC, which is highly significant as it marks approximately the transition from the late Neolithic to the early Bronze Age, at the time associated with the catastrophic event at around 3195 and the mass movements of people, which I mentioned earlier. These distinctive groups, and I'm sorry to have to use sort of codified language here, but J2A1H M319 and J2A1B M92, have demographic properties consistent with Bronze Age inward migration to Crete, one of which, M3119, is not well represented in Western Anatolia, but it does become a characteristic subgroup on Crete. The other group, M92, is found at relatively high frequencies in northwestern and western Anatolia, shown here in regions T1 and T8. And this provides us with data to show where they were coming from into Crete at this time. So during the transition between the Neolithic and the early Bronze Age, the incoming migrants are, it seems, from Anatolia, bringing with them the technologies and skills rooted in Old World civilizations. So it seems we have a melting pot of peoples on the island at around 3000 BC. Migrants from Anatolia via the Dodecanese, settling on the east coast of Crete and possibly also on the Messara plain. Cycladic islanders settling in north-central Crete and further along the coast towards the east of the island. And a strong indigenous community at the major centre of Knossos. Well, how do these different communities with their different traditions combine to become the so-called Minoans? How does the combination of ancient knowledge come to fruition in the Middle Bronze Age, as demonstrated by the emergence of the so-called Minoan palace civilizations? The end of the early Bronze Age appears to be marked by a widespread horizon of collapse of Old World urban centres. But at the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age on Crete, uniquely in the Aegean, it witnessed the emergence of the so-called Minoan palace civilization. Between 1950 and 1800 BC, there are monumentalized centres at Knossos, Festos and Malea, with ports, peak sanctuaries and large urban centres surrounding the main buildings. And this is a representation of the late palace. This is the second palace. We can't actually get to anything below this. They don't let you dig down too far around here, so we don't actually know what the first palace looked like. but this is a reconstruction of the second one. Between 1950 and 1800, some elite individuals received monumental burials in addition to these large structures being built. But why did this happen? One explanation might be that the collapse of Old World centres occurring around 2200 BC was serious enough that it created a vacuum which the emerging Minoans filled. The demise of Old World civilizations is likely to be linked to rapid climate change, possibly triggered by meteors exploding in airbursts high above the ground as the Earth travelled through a dense concentration of debris. The rapid climate change resulted in less rainfall, changes in sea levels, catastrophic floods and changes in river courses, and widespread seismic activity. And that was across the world. The evidence suggests that this was a global event. The collapse of the Old World kingdoms, well, this was quite widespread. It was the end of the Old World kingdom in Egypt. The Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia collapsed. Troy too collapsed, as well as other sites in Anatolia. Mohenjo-Daro and other sites of northwestern India collapsed, as well as the sites on the Greek mainland and on the Cyclades. Destructions and/or abandonments throughout the southern Aegean marked the end of the early Bronze Age II, or EB2 period, at about 2200 BC. The period that followed in both the Cyclades and the Greek mainland is viewed as a cultural setback for those areas. But Crete doesn't have the marked destruction or abandonment that occurs elsewhere. On present evidence, destructions seem only to have occurred at to the east of the island. But is it the collapse of other major civilizations enough to push Crete to the fore at this time? Well, by itself, probably not. It might be a necessary condition, but by itself, collapse elsewhere does not explain why the so-called palaces emerge on Crete. Another explanation might be that during this period, immediately before the widespread collapse at the end of the early Bronze Age, Cretan society had gradually reached a point where it could emerge as a state. Evidence for growing social complexity, and some would argue social hierarchy, is shown by the appearance of some larger and more complex buildings at several points on Crete, several of the major centres. For example, David Wilson talks about this happening in eastern Crete, where, in contrast to other regions, there was expansion immediately before 2200. Settlement sites such as Moklos, which is marked there, and Vasiliki show evidence of possible social hierarchy at this time. At Moklos, the house tombs contained objects of gold jewellery. Quite beautiful they are. And at Vasiliki, an impressive multi-roomed, multi-storied building was built with a deep basement storerooms, fine red plastered walls, and a large paved courtyard on the west. Sturt Manning talks about new courtyard compounds appearing at about 2300 BC and cites the central courts of both Knossos and Malea as evidence of certain groups starting to assert control over pre-existing communal meeting spaces. Knossos had been a focal point for feasting and celebrating since about 2600, if not before. There's some archaeologists believe that it went into the Neolithic period. And this is evidenced by large numbers of pouring and drinking vessels at the site. And this is also true of Phaistos. But Manning makes the point that we shouldn't get carried away here, as most of the evidence still points to low-level village-scale community on Crete, and the evidence does not suggest a centralized authority. So at the point of the widespread destruction at the end of the early Bronze Age, Crete had become emergent, but no more. So if neither of these two explanations give a satisfactory account of what the main reason was for the rapid rise of the Minoan palace culture, what does? Well, a third and more likely explanation is that it was a combination of both the collapse of the old world civilizations and Crete's stage of development at the time of that collapse, coming together at the right time in prehistory, combining to provide the impetus for Cretan culture to come to the fore. But were both the collapse of the old world civilizations and the emergence of the palaces happening at roughly the same time? That is about the end of the early Bronze Age, between 2200 and 1950 BC. Well, current evidence suggests that they were. At precisely the time that collapse is occurring in the Aegean, the Near East and in Egypt, a dramatic transformation appears to take place in pre-palatial Crete, which was sustained at the three major sites, Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, well into and throughout the First Palace period. Archaeologist Todd Whitelaw tells us that this is most clear in the massive settlement expansion which can be documented at all three emerging palatial sites. Very recent evidence suggests that the size of Knossos at about 2,200 is 6.5 hectares. That's just about 16 acres. But by 1800 BC, this had grown to 57 hectares. That's 141 acres in size. And population for the same period grew from 2,600 to between 16 and 25,000 people. John Cherry tells us that when contact resumed after the disruptions, emergent Cretan elites were well placed to step in and take control of access to raw materials for the production of high-value, high-status goods. A fundamental reason for the opening up of trade at this time is discussed by Cherry. He states, and I quote, "A key factor in this regard is the introduction of a masted, plank-built sailing ships into the Aegean at just this time, to judge from the first depictions of them on Minoan sills at the end of the early Bronze Age and the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age. Although still relatively small and more suited for low-bulk, high-impact cargoes, these vessels would have had the effect of opening up the Eastern the Eastern Mediterranean to trade, well beyond the relatively short hops that characterised the canoe-based travel within the Aegean before this time." So to summarise, from the early Neolithic, we have evidence of DNA analysis as well as floral and faunal analysis that suggests that ancient knowledge on Crete came with migrants from the regions of Çatalhöyük, Hasilar, and Asiklihuik, as well as Yumuktepe. Moving on to the transition between the final Neolithic and the early Bronze Age, DNA analysis supports the evidence that populations moved from northwest and western Anatolia. We have settlement evidence that suggests migrants from Anatolia as well as the Cycladian islands, and evidence from Knossos that suggests a flourishing indigenous population on Crete. And from the transition from the pre-palatial with the First Palace period, we have evidence to show that emergent Minoans, a melting pot of diverse peoples and knowledge, came to the fore when contact with other regions began to pick up after the disruptions at the end of the early Bronze Age. Although foreign settlement and contact played a major role in the earliest history of Minoan Crete, the island in its turn would take the initiative at the start of the Middle Bronze Age, in reaching out to the wider Aegean. This contact would have a significant bearing on cultural developments in the Aegean for the next half a millennium, truly, therefore, entitling Crete to the status of the cradle of European civilization, and not Greece, as many have been led to believe. This new child is the offspring of the Old World, of Anatolia and the Near East, combined with the newly emergent Minoans. So ancient knowledge is preserved and passed on no longer by migrant farmers from the Eastern Mediterranean, but by traders and colonizers from Crete. The Aegean period, which originated with pre-human populations in Africa during the Lower Paleolithic. Aegean is the name given to an archaeological industry of stone tool manufacture that's associated with early humans during the Lower Paleolithic period, about 1.7 million years ago. And this is sensational news because Crete has been an island for over 5 million years. So these early visitors reached the island using sea craft capable of open sea navigation and multiple journeys. This is really exciting because it pushes back previous evidence of seafaring in the Mediterranean by more than 100,000 years. Previous evidence was from the Frankfurt cave region, where obsidian from the island of Milos was found at about 10,000 BC. So what does this show? Firstly, it creates the problem. Before we start, let's take a look and have a look where Crete's located. Crete is the largest island in the Aegean, and it's the 5th largest island in the Mediterranean. It lies to the south of the Aegean Sea and forms a link between Europe, Asia, and Africa. And this geographical position at the junction of major civilizations and cultural currents has greatly influenced Crete's history. I'm going to be talking about 3 major transition points in Cretan prehistory today. Firstly, the initial Neolithic at around 7000 BC. Secondly, the final Neolithic transition with the early Bronze Age between 3500 and 3000 BC. And thirdly, the pre-palatial transition, probability that, although not yet fully recognised in the archaeological record, there is likely to have been indigenous pre-Neolithic population on Crete. Secondly, it shows that from very early on, Crete is likely to have been accessible from both the Eastern Mediterranean and also from North Africa. And this demonstrates that ancient knowledge on Crete goes back much further than the Neolithic. Returning to the Neolithic, Crete is significant because it's one of the earliest areas outside of the Near East to have had village farming. And it's also one of the earliest successful maritime transfers of a full farming economy. But what is the actual evidence on Crete for new migrants arriving and bringing their knowledge with them? What changes are showing up in the archaeological record? I've divided the evidence up into two groups. Evidence relating to people, that's DNA, Minos, the Minotaur, Theseus, and that Crete, like Sparta or Athens, is just another Greek kingdom. But who were the Cretans? And where did they come from? And where did the ancient knowledge that led to the flourishing culture of the Minoan palaces come from or originate? Up until recently, it was believed that the first visitors to Crete were Neolithic farmers arriving at about 7000 BC. That is until Thomas Strasser's team from Providence College on Rhode Island discovered some very exciting evidence during a survey in 2008-2009. Excavations in the Plakius region of Crete revealed stone tools made of quartz, at least 130,000 years old. Even more intriguing, the style of the hand axes suggests that they could be anything up to 700,000 years old, as they resemble artifacts from to the First Palace period at 2200 to 1950 BC. I plan to show that the emergence of the so-called Minoan civilization or palace culture is the result of both internal and external knowledge. That is, the coming together of socially more complex peoples from Anatolia and the Near East, the skills and resources from the Cycladic islands, and the internal infrastructure created by the indigenous Cretan people. Although I won't be focusing upon the individual components of eternal knowledge, I will be trying to identify the likely regions of origin for ancient knowledge coming to Crete at these important points in time. I've included a range of evidence from a number of different experts in order to give as clear a picture as possible of what appears to be happening. When most people think of Crete, they think of kingdoms